My name is Koen Coppenholle. I'm Chief Executive of Cembureu, the European Cement Association, and we are representing the cement industry with the European institutions on the main items that are of concern to our companies, but that also provide opportunities for our companies. You can recycle the concrete. I mean, when a building, for instance, is demolished, you have the possibility to recycle concrete and to use it as an aggregate into either new cement production or into new concrete production. The issue is that you can do that or you can use it as a road base, and that entails a whole set of discussions about how sustainable is that recycling. We plead for sustainability, which is a sustainability along the three pillars. In other words, when we say you cannot recycle it back into cement or concrete, but you can use it as a road base, that can be a more sustainable option. Recycling is one part of it, where we are working hard also with the European Commission to make sure that at member state level, construction and demolition waste, which is a very important part of the whole waste of member states, that is increased in terms of the recycling rates of construction and demolition waste are increased at member state level. The CO2 in concrete is reabsorbed when it is exposed to the air, and that happens during the life of a building, but especially at the moment the building is deconstructed or is demolished. At that moment, the exposure to the air of the concrete becomes stronger, and that's where the CO2 is reabsorbed. And the study we have done shows that basically we have up to 25% of the emissions, the process emissions, are reabsorbed at the end of life of a building. And that's why, again, coming back to what I said before, we need to have a full supply chain approach, because if you stop at the manufacturing, of course you're going to say it's CO2 and energy intensive. But if you look at the use phase, the durability of concrete during the lifetime of a building, which is 100 years, I mean between 50 and 100 years. I mean, if you look at the full life cycle of a building, the recyclability, the recarbonation potential, you're coming to a very sustainable product that contributes to the whole debate on climate change. Well, the potential savings, I mean, it's difficult to express it now in specific numbers at this stage, because we are still doing studies on many parts of that supply chain. I mean, the recarbonation was 1 point, up to 25%, yes. Thermal mass is more difficult to assess. In practice, the thermal mass has a capacity to keep the temperature in a building at a pretty constant level. And that means in the summertime you need less air conditioning. In the wintertime you need less heating. And that means you reduce your CO2. The innovation in Europe is there. It's essential, and that's where Europe can take the lead worldwide. But we need cooperation with the governments. We need cooperation with the European Union to make it happen. Because the risk is, if you don't pay attention to the competitiveness of the companies, you're going to have companies that do not have enough profitability to make the investments in innovation. And profitability is not a dirty word. And that's where the whole European climate change agenda comes in. And that's also where we make our arguments, is to say we need to innovate. I mean, for instance, we have a low-carbon roadmap that we developed in 2013. It's still valid in terms of what we do going towards 2050, because that was the horizon we were looking at. The conventional technologies allow us to reduce our emissions by 32%. But we need breakthrough technologies like carbon capture and used carbon capture and storage, which take the 32% to 80%. But that's exactly requiring time, it's requiring investments, it's also looking at public funding, and it's looking at infrastructure for CO2 pipelines, infrastructure for CO2 storage. That's the issue that we need to address, is to make sure that companies are viable enough and profitable enough to make the investments in innovation that will continue driving Europe as a driving force for climate change worldwide. I'm very encouraged by recent initiatives that have been taken at European level. We are a member of the high-level group of energy-intensive industries. We've been active there since 2015. The high-level group in the beginning did good work, but I think the work has intensified. It was the first time that we really came together as 11 energy-intensive industries, and we did a study with the University of Brussels with Thomas Wijns, who has developed a study where we looked at 80 technologies that we have in common, or not in common, but 80 technologies we have for all the energy-intensive industries that are allowing the low-carbon transition. Apart from setting out the technologies, we also set out which regulatory requirements are needed. If we move to decarbonization, for instance, we will use much more electricity. So we will see a shift from direct emissions to indirect emissions. And then the whole question is that electricity needs to come from renewable sources. The study has calculated that in 2050, the electricity needs for the energy-intensive sectors will be as high as the electricity needs for the whole of Europe right now. That's a challenge. So who is going to provide the renewable electricity? What is going to be the cost? Who's going to finance it? How are we going to do it? The same for carbon capture. As I said, carbon capture infrastructure, carbon capture and storage. Where are the storage sites in Europe? How are we going to transport? Who is going to give the permits? The population needs to be convinced of public acceptance of these storages and of these transports. So how are we going to do that? And that requires cooperation. And that is happening in the high-level group with the European Commission, and I find that very encouraging to see that the Commission is indeed involving all the different directors general in that discussion, is involving the member states, is involving NGOs. So we have a very broad platform where we discuss all these issues, and that's enriching, and I think that's pretty new in the whole debate. I think the EU will always be in a slightly difficult position when it comes to global climate change negotiations. I think the US not signing up to the Paris Agreement is a major issue, I would say, not only because it's not signing up to specific commitments or specific targets, but the financing of the whole Paris Agreement is essential. And the developing countries were counting on financing to move in the direction of achieving their targets or achieving their NDCs, and the EU needs to make sure that it is indeed continuing to play that international role, also to understand how other systems evolve. But we believe that you can't, as Europe, be an island where you say we are doing fantastic in terms of climate change, but we're not taking into account the imports from third countries that do not have that climate change legislation. As an industry, that's a concern to us. That can't happen. That can't be the philosophy of Europe. You need to keep your industry viable in Europe, viable to invest in innovation, viable to invest in growth, but also in employees and social skills. I mean, again, coming back to sustainability as the three-pillar approach, it's economic, environment, and social. We need to make sure that we keep the employment in Europe as well, in addition to growth and environmental progress. I think if there is one area, but it is developing, one area where indeed a change is needed is to make sure that you have that full two-pillar approach between, on the one hand, incentives in regulation to drive down emissions, but on the other hand, financial support to make it happen. And the CO2 price is one element of that, but it will not be the only element, because if you're talking about breakthrough technologies, for instance, these are technologies that carry significant risks, financial risks, but also technological risks. And that's where the public funding needs to come in. And that public funding needs to be clearer for companies to make decisions. Boards of companies are deciding on the basis of a long-term legal certainty. I mean, our businesses, our companies and industry is based on a 30-year investment cycle, and we need certainty for that long period. I think we need to shake things up, or we will need to shake things up. You can start at the level where you say, okay, shake things up in terms of a breakthrough technology is already shaking up anyway. I mean, if you're talking about carbon capture and storage, it's already shaking up the industry, because that's really an important development. But shaking up will also mean other developments, and they're ongoing, but they need to be intensified. If I'm talking about, for instance, circular economy, we are using waste in our industry from a variety of waste streams. But that means that we need access to waste from other industries. And these other industries need to work together, and our plants need to be close to where we can get the waste, so that transport is minimized. And that's That's a formula and that's a business model that will develop over time. And that is industrial symbiosis. Another disruption, I think, will come. If we don't move, it will be forced upon us. But the whole digitization agenda will move the businesses in different business models. You will see that basically the whole distribution area, it will be the question about who does it. Is it the manufacturing companies that are going to engage in that area? Is it going to be the Amazons or whatever? I mean, it's the same discussion in the car manufacturing sector, I guess, where you have the question about the self-driving car. Is it going to be Google developing it, or is it BMW that will develop it? I mean, I think it's a question that we should ask ourselves, and that will come also in the construction sector. Europe has been built on avoiding or making sure that there's peace between the countries and the original countries of the European Union, European Economic Community at the time, etc. Then we had the 1992 project of Mr. Delors, President of the European Commission, eliminating all barriers within the European Union internal market program. Okay, I mean, I admit that not all the barriers have been eliminated, but it was a project. And everybody was talking about that single project. All the policies were working towards that single project. And I think we need a project like this one that is unifying all the countries of Europe, because we have many issues now that are dividing Europe and are not necessarily the core competence of the European Union. I mean, if you look at migration, if you look at the Brexit, I mean, Europe, the member states have transferred competences to the European Union in areas that are not the core areas that are under discussion now in Europe. So Europe has in a way been sidetracked from these discussions, and that's dangerous for the future of Europe, for the survival of Europe. We need to come back to the core competences of Europe and see whether we can design a common project. I mean, industrial policy may be one of them, but I think you need again much more engagement from citizens that buy into a common project, that Europe becomes again something attractive to people who say, yeah, I see why Europe is important for us.